Sarah Okafor called the Tulsa Police Department's non-emergency line on October 9, 2021, at 2:14 in the afternoon. She told the officer who answered that she wanted to report her partner, Jason Pellegrino, as a missing person. She said he had been gone for 11 days. The officer asked why she had waited 11 days to call. Sarah said, because for most of those 11 days, she had believed the messages she was receiving from Jason's phone were actually from Jason, and that it had taken her 11 days to understand that they weren't. By the time Sarah Okafor made that phone call, she had already done something that law enforcement would later describe as remarkable and that Jason's family would describe, more simply, as an act of love. She had, over the course of 4 days, assembled enough evidence about what had happened to Jason that she arrived at the Tulsa Police Department not just as a missing person reporter but as someone who could tell investigators, with documented specificity, who she believed had killed him and why. She was right about both. This is the story of Jason Pellegrino, who he was, what was done to him, and how the woman who loved him refused to accept what she was being told until she found the truth herself. Tulsa, Oklahoma sits at the center of a state that most of the country knows only as a flyover, which is a significant underestimation of a city of 400,000 people with a history as layered and consequential as anywhere in America. It is a city that built itself on oil, that carries the weight of the 1921 race massacre in its DNA, that has rebuilt and reimagined itself multiple times, and that, in 2021, had a homicide rate that placed it among the higher crime major cities in its region, a fact that its residents live with in the pragmatic way that residents of high crime cities do, not ignoring it but not letting it define every interaction. Jason Pellegrino grew up in Broken Arrow, a Tulsa suburb, the younger of 2 sons of an Italian-American father who ran a restaurant supply business and a mother who taught high school mathematics. He was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a person of genuine warmth and complete reliability, the kind of man people described, without hesitation and without having to search for the word, as good. He had, at the time of his disappearance, been running a small commercial cleaning company, Pellegrino Property Services, for 7 years. The business employed 14 people at its height, served commercial and residential clients across Tulsa County, and had, in 2019, expanded into property maintenance and light renovation work. It was a modest business, not a glamorous one. Jason was proud of it in the way people are proud of things they built with their own hands and maintained with their own effort. His business partner. In 2018, Jason had taken on a business partner, Derek Shaw, 42, a Tulsa businessman with a background in commercial real estate who had approached Jason with a proposal to expand Pellegrino Property Services into larger commercial contracts. Shaw was, in outward presentation, exactly the kind of person a small business owner might hope to partner with, well-connected, financially experienced, and apparently genuinely enthusiastic about the expansion potential of what Jason had built. The partnership had been formalized in a document drafted by Shaw's attorney. It gave Shaw a 49% stake in the business in exchange for a capital investment of $180,000, money that Jason used to purchase equipment, hire additional staff, and pursue the larger commercial contracts Shaw's connections had made possible. The document also contained a survivorship clause, a standard provision in business partnerships, that gave the surviving partner the right to purchase the deceased partner's stake at fair market value in the event of death. The business grew. By 2021, Pellegrino Property Services had annual revenues of approximately $2.1 million. Jason's 51% share of the business was worth, by conservative estimation, somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000. Derek Shaw had, investigators would later establish, been tracking that valuation carefully. Sarah Sarah Okafor had met Jason in 2017 at a community fundraiser for Tulsa's Emergency Food Pantry Network. She was a volunteer coordinator. He was there dropping off a supply donation from the business. They had been together for 4 years by the time he disappeared. They were not married, had talked about it, had a shared understanding that it was coming, but they shared a house in Midtown Tulsa that they had spent the better part of 2 years making their own. Sarah worked as a patient navigator at a Tulsa area hospital system, a role that required her to coordinate care for patients with complex needs, to track multiple moving parts simultaneously, and to notice when something in a system didn't add up. These professional qualities, the pattern recognition, the systematic thinking, the refusal to accept an incomplete account, would, in the 11 days of Jason's disappearance, become the most important skills in the investigation. She would use them to find out what had happened to the man she loved. And she would use them to make sure the person who had done it could not escape it. On the morning of September 28, 2021, Jason Pellegrino left his and Sarah's house in Midtown Tulsa at approximately 7:40 a.m. Sarah saw him leave. He kissed her goodbye, told her he had a site visit with Derek Shaw at a commercial property they were considering for a new maintenance contract. He said he'd be home for dinner. He said he'd text her when he was on his way back. He did not come home for dinner. He did not text. At 7:15 p.m., Sarah texted Jason's cell phone. At 7:48 p.m., the phone replied, "Running late, site visit went long, heading to see a client after. Don't wait up." Sarah found the message slightly unusual. Jason was reliable about communication, and "don't wait up" was not a phrase he typically used. But she accepted it. She went to bed. She waited. Over the following days, the messages continued. They were brief, functional, and slightly off in a way that Sarah would later describe as impossible to pin down precisely in the moment, like hearing a recording of someone's voice that is accurate in every detail but somehow not quite right. The cadence was slightly wrong. The warmth was present but not entirely natural. Jason texted her every day between September 28th and October 5th, once or twice a day, always brief, always with an explanation for his continued absence that was plausible in isolation but that added up, over days, to a picture that had no coherent shape. He was helping a client with an emergency renovation. He needed to stay close to the site. He'd be home soon. On October 6th, the text stopped. The silence. 2 days of silence. Sarah called Jason's cell phone 14 times between October 6th and October 7th. Every call went to voicemail. She texted. No replies. She called Derek Shaw. Shaw answered on the second ring. He told Sarah that he hadn't spoken to Jason in several days, that Jason had been working independently on a project and that he'd assumed he was in contact with Sarah. He said he'd try to reach him and let her know. He expressed appropriate concern. He sounded, Sarah later said, exactly as worried as a business partner should sound. He called her back an hour later. He said he couldn't reach Jason either. He said maybe Jason needed some space, that Jason had seemed stressed recently about some personal things he hadn't elaborated on. He said he was sure he'd be in touch soon. Sarah registered 2 things about that call. First, Jason was not a person who needed space. Not from her. They had been together for 4 years and she knew him as well as she knew herself, and taking space without communication was not something he did. Second, the phrase "personal things he hadn't elaborated on" was oddly specific. Like a detail prepared in advance rather than offered spontaneously. She didn't say any of this to Shaw. She thanked him and hung up. And she started thinking. The messages Sarah had been receiving from Jason's phone for 11 days were not from Jason. She would confirm this, ultimately, through a combination of her own analysis and digital forensics. But she had begun to suspect it on day 8, not from any single detail but from the accumulation of small things that didn't fit the man she knew. What didn't fit? Sarah had, without consciously framing it this way, been running a continuous verification process against the messages she was receiving. The professional habit of checking information against established baselines was operating below the level of deliberate thought. What didn't fit? Jason always used her nickname in texts, a specific abbreviated version of her name that was theirs alone. None of the messages used it. Jason had a specific autocorrect pattern on his phone, a word he habitually misspelled that his phone had been correcting for years in a distinctive way. The messages were spelled correctly. Jason ended most texts with an X. One X. Always. None of the messages had it. Each of these details was minor. None of them, individually, was conclusive. Together, they were a portrait of someone who knew Jason well enough to impersonate him in general terms, but not well enough to replicate the specific texture of his daily communication. On October 8th, the day before she called the police, Sarah drove to Pellegrino Property Services office on the south side of Tulsa. She told the office manager, a woman named Diane Tully, that she was trying to locate Jason. Diane told her that Jason hadn't been in the office for nearly 2 weeks. That Derek Shaw had told the staff Jason was working off-site on a special project and wasn't to be disturbed. That no one had found that unusual because Shaw was a partner and partners sometimes managed staff assignments differently. Sarah drove home. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened Jason's laptop. She knew his password. They had always shared it for practical reasons. She started reading. In the 4 days between October 5th, when she first allowed herself to seriously consider that something was wrong, and October 9th when she called the police, Sarah Okafor conducted an investigation of Derek Shaw's relationship with Jason and with Pellegrino Property Services that investigators would later describe as more thorough than what most detectives could accomplish in the same time frame with full departmental resources. She was not a detective. She had no law enforcement training. What she had was 4 years of professional experience tracking complex, multi-party patient care situations, identifying where systems broke down, where information had been withheld, where the official account diverged from what the patient was actually experiencing. She applied that skill set, with full and undivided attention, to the question of what had happened to Jason. The business finances. The first thing Sarah examined was the business. She had access to the shared financial accounts, not because she had been involved in running Pellegrino Property Services, but because Jason had added her as an authorized account holder in 2020, a practical decision they had made together after a health scare of his that had turned out to be nothing but that had made both of them think about contingency planning. What she found in the business accounts told a story. Over the preceding 8 months, a series of transfers had moved money from the business operating account to a holding account that was accessible only to Derek Shaw. The transfers were individually small enough, each between $8,000 and $15,000, to avoid the automatic flagging threshold for unusual transactions. Together, they totaled $247,000. There were also, she found, a series of contract amendments, changes to the terms of 3 major commercial accounts that had been executed with Derek Shaw's signature alone, without Jason's countersignature as required under the partnership agreement. The amendments modified the payment terms of those contracts in ways that channeled a larger share of revenues into the account Shaw controlled. She printed everything. She dated and labeled every document. She created a folder on her kitchen table that she labeled, in her precise handwriting, what Derek did. The phone records. Sarah requested, through the online account portal that she had access to as an authorized account holder, 90 days of call records from Jason's business cell phone account. The account was registered to the business, which meant she had legal access to it as an account holder. The records showed that in the 2 weeks before September 28th, the last day anyone who loved Jason had spoken to him, Jason had made a significant number of calls to the business's attorney of record. The calls were outgoing, from Jason to the attorney. They were long, the longest ran nearly 40 minutes. She did not yet know what those calls had contained. But she understood what calls to an attorney, placed repeatedly and at length, in the weeks before a person disappeared, could mean. A person who had discovered something and was seeking advice about it. A person who was concerned about a situation in their professional life and was trying to understand their options. She wrote it down. Derek Shaw's history. Public records, business filings, court records, newspaper archives are not restricted documents. Sarah knew how to use search engines. She spent an afternoon on October 7th researching Derek Shaw's background in the way that journalists research subjects, methodically, with a records-based discipline, following each thread to its end before starting the next one. What she found: Derek Shaw had been the subject of a civil lawsuit in 2015, filed by a former business partner in a Broken Arrow real estate venture. The lawsuit alleged financial mismanagement and the diversion of partnership funds. It had been settled out of court in 2016 under terms that were confidential but whose existence was public record. Shaw had also been named as a respondent, not a defendant, a respondent, in a 2017 Oklahoma Securities Department inquiry related to investor disclosures in a commercial development project. The inquiry had been closed without enforcement action. But it existed. A pattern. Not proof, but a pattern. She added it to the folder. Sarah Okafor arrived at the Tulsa Police Department's downtown headquarters on October 9, 2021, at approximately 3:30 p.m., 90 minutes after making her non-emergency call. She had her folder. She had her printed documents. She had a handwritten summary, 4 pages, structured as a timeline with annotated evidence references. The detective who received her initial report was Detective Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Tulsa PD's Homicide Unit. Webb had been in the unit for 8 years. He later told the court that in those 8 years, no missing person report had arrived with documentation of this quality. He spent 2 hours with Sarah going through everything she had brought. He asked questions. She answered them precisely, with reference to the specific documents in her folder. When she didn't know something, when there was a gap in what she had been able to establish, she said so explicitly, without trying to fill it with inference. Webb noted this. In the investigation report he filed that evening, he wrote, "Complainant's account is internally consistent, well documented, and characterized by an unusual degree of evidential precision. Treat as high credibility information source." The search begins. A formal missing persons investigation was opened for Jason Pellegrino on October 9th. Given the financial documentation Sarah had provided, the case was simultaneously flagged for the Homicide Unit's review, an unusual dual designation that reflected Webb's assessment that the disappearance and the business activity were connected and that the business activity suggested a serious crime. The first investigative priority was Jason's cell phone. The phone that had been sending messages to Sarah was tracked through its carrier's records. The location data from the phone told the story immediately. In the 11 days of Jason's disappearance, the phone had never left the Tulsa metropolitan area. It had, in fact, remained consistently within a few miles of Derek Shaw's home address in South Tulsa. The phone was in Shaw's possession. Shaw had been sending the messages. The phone was located and seized through a warrant executed on October 11th. Forensic analysis confirmed that the messages sent to Sarah after September 28 had been typed by a different person than the messages sent before that date. Linguistic analysis of the typing patterns, the rhythm, the word choices, the autocorrect patterns, confirmed what Sarah had already established through her own observation. The messages were not from Jason. Derek Shaw, the first interview. Derek Shaw was brought in for a voluntary interview on October 12th. He arrived with an attorney, a detail that Webb noted was the choice of a person who had considered the possibility of this conversation and had prepared for it. The attorney was experienced in criminal defense. Shaw had retained him, his billing records later showed, on September 29th, one day after Jason disappeared. Shaw's account of Jason's disappearance was consistent with what he had told Sarah. Jason had been working on a side project. Jason had seemed stressed. He had assumed Jason was taking some personal time. He did not know where Jason was. He was very concerned. Detective Webb asked Shaw, toward the end of the interview, whether he was aware that Jason's phone had been in the vicinity of Shaw's home address for the preceding 2 weeks. Shaw said he wasn't aware of that. He said Jason had visited him a couple of times in that period and may have left his phone behind. He said he'd look for it. Webb thanked him and closed the interview. Outside the interview room, Webb told his partner he knew the question was coming. Watch the attorney. Detective Webb knew, by the end of the October 12th interview, that Derek Shaw had almost certainly killed Jason Pellegrino. What he did not yet know was where Jason was. And until Jason was found, the case could not move from suspicion to charge. The investigative team working the Pellegrino case under Detective Webb's supervision spent 11 days, October 9th through October 20th, building the evidentiary case that would allow them to find Jason and to charge Derek Shaw with his murder. The first significant break came from Jason's personal vehicle. His truck, a 2018 Ford F-150, dark gray, had been reported by Sarah as also missing. License plate readers at toll points and intersections across Tulsa County are logged automatically, and the Tulsa PD's ALPR database showed Jason's truck making an unusual series of movements on the night of September 28th. The truck left Midtown Tulsa at approximately 9:15 p.m., approximately 13 hours after Jason had left the house that morning, and drove south on Highway 75 to a rural area outside the town of Sapulpa, in Crete County. The truck returned to Tulsa approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes later. The truck had been driven by someone. Jason's phone, in Shaw's possession, had not moved that night. Whoever drove Jason's truck on the night of September 28th had their own means of return transportation. Crete County. South on Highway 75. Rural area outside Sapulpa. Webb submitted a request to Crete County Sheriff's Office for assistance with a search of rural and semi-rural properties in the corridor south of the Highway 75 toll on September 28th. The property. Derek Shaw's disclosed assets, identified through the financial forensics running parallel to the physical investigation, included a property in Crete County. Not in his name directly. In the name of a limited liability company registered in 2019 to an address that was Shaw's home address. Investigators found this connection on October 16th, 7 days after Sarah had walked into the TPD building with her folder. The property was a 14-acre parcel with a small agricultural structure and an access road off a county highway. It was not a property that appeared in any of Shaw's public business dealings. It had been purchased, through the LLC, in March 2020. A search warrant for the Crete County property was issued on October 18th. Officers and investigators arrived at the property at 7:45 a.m. on October 19th. Jason Pellegrino was found at 9:12 a.m. He had been buried in a location behind the agricultural structure. The burial was shallow, not the work of someone who had time to prepare or who had expected a prolonged absence to be necessary. The manner of burial spoke to urgency more than planning. The Tulsa County Medical Examiner's Office took jurisdiction. The cause of death was established within 48 hours: blunt force trauma. Jason Pellegrino had been beaten to death. The medical examiner's report placed the time of death at the early hours of September 29th, hours after Jason's truck had made its journey south on Highway 75 and returned. Jason was 37 years old. He had built a business from nothing. He had been planning to propose to Sarah. The ring was in a box in the back of his truck center console. It was recovered by investigators at the impound yard. Sarah was told about it by Detective Webb in a conversation she has since described as the moment when grief arrived fully and completely, without any remaining space for the forward momentum of investigation to hold it at bay. She had known he was gone. She had known for days. But there is a difference between knowing and being told, and that difference is where grief lives. Derek Shaw was arrested on October 21, 2021, at his South Tulsa home. He was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and evidence tampering. The evidence tampering charge related specifically to the 11 days of text messages sent from Jason's phone, a period during which Shaw had been actively misleading Sarah and, by extension, delaying the involvement of law enforcement. The case against Shaw was, by the time of his arrest, substantially complete. The financial forensics, the $247,000 in diverted funds, the unsigned contract amendments, the business attorney's records which a subpoena revealed showed that Jason had been seeking legal advice about what he believed was financial fraud by his partner, established the motive. The cell phone evidence, the vehicle tracking data, and the Crete County property established the timeline and the physical circumstances. The reconstructed timeline. Investigators reconstructed the events of September 28th with a precision that the prosecution would later present to the jury as a complete sequential account. At approximately 7 a.m. on September 28th, Jason had received a call from Derek Shaw proposing a morning site visit to a commercial property in South Tulsa. This was consistent with the account Jason had given Sarah before leaving the house. The site visit was genuine. CCTV from a neighboring property showed both Shaw's and Jason's vehicles at the location between approximately 8 a.m. and 9:15 a.m. What happened at the site visit is established through Shaw's eventual partial account, given under circumstances that will be addressed shortly, and through physical evidence. Jason had, at the site visit, confronted Shaw about the financial irregularities he had discovered. He had come to the meeting prepared, his attorney had advised him to document the confrontation, and Jason had activated a voice recording app on his phone before the meeting began. That recording, recovered from a cloud backup that Shaw had not known existed, because the phone's automatic cloud sync had uploaded the file before Shaw took possession of it, captured 42 minutes of conversation. Jason's accusations. Shaw's initial denials. Jason's specific, documented counter-evidence that made denial untenable. Shaw's shift, toward the end of the recording, from denial to something that the jury would later be told to characterize as calculation. The recording ended. Shaw had taken the phone. The site visit concluded. The two men left separately, but Shaw had offered to drive Jason to a second location later that day to view paperwork that Shaw claimed would explain the financial discrepancies. Jason, whose attorney had apparently advised him to continue documenting, had agreed. He had gone willingly. Because he trusted Shaw to explain. Because he was not a man who assumed the worst of people he had worked alongside for 3 years. Because the good people are often the ones who don't see it coming, because they cannot conceive of the thing coming. The accomplice. One element of the case that received significant attention in the investigation was the question of whether Shaw had acted alone. The physical evidence of the burial, the vehicle movements, and the timeline suggested that at minimum a second person had been present to provide Shaw with return transportation from the Crete County property. Shaw's brother-in-law, a man named Gus Harmon, 38, was identified through cell tower data that placed him in the Crete County area on the night of September 28th. He was interviewed, under caution, in November 2021. He declined to provide an account. He was charged with accessory after the fact and evidence tampering. He ultimately cooperated, under a plea agreement, and provided the prosecution with a corroborating account of the events of the night of September 28th. His cooperation agreement required full disclosure in exchange for a reduced charge. He was sentenced in a separate proceeding to 6 years. The trial of Derek Shaw opened in Tulsa County District Court on September 12, 2022, almost exactly 1 year after Jason Pellegrino was killed. The case was prosecuted by Tulsa County District Attorney's Office lead trial attorney Camille Adeyemi, experienced, methodical, and in possession of an evidentiary record that she later described as among the most complete she had assembled in 15 years of criminal prosecution. The trial lasted 16 days. The jury heard testimony from 23 witnesses, reviewed over 400 documentary exhibits, and listened to 42 minutes of audio from Jason's cloud-recovered recording. The audio recording, played in its entirety in court, was the prosecution's most powerful single piece of evidence. It was powerful not because it captured the crime itself, but because it captured the sequence of a relationship, professional, trusted, 3 years in the making, coming apart in real time. It captured Jason Pellegrino as he actually was, calm, specific, thorough, and, even in the confrontation, not hostile. He was not angry at Shaw in the way a person who has already decided what they believe is angry. He was asking for an explanation, genuinely, until the point at which it became clear there was none. The jury heard Jason's voice for 42 minutes. They heard him use Shaw's first name. They heard him cite document numbers. They heard him say, near the end of the recording, that he intended to refer the matter to his attorney and that he hoped they could resolve it between them before it became something larger. Then the recording ended. Camille Adeyemi said nothing after the recording finished. She let the silence run for 8 seconds. Then she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the next sound Jason Pellegrino heard from Derek Shaw came approximately 6 hours later, at the second location, and it did not come through a voice." The courtroom was completely still. The defense. Shaw's defense, led by attorney Philip Drago, mounted what Tulsa legal observers characterized as a competent but structurally limited case. Drago argued that the financial activities in the business were the result of mutually agreed informal arrangements that had not been properly documented, that the irregularities Sarah and investigators had identified were, in fact, legitimate operational decisions made under an expanded interpretation of Shaw's partnership authority. He argued that the physical evidence placing Shaw at the Crete County property was circumstantial, that the property was in a company partially associated with Shaw but that many people had access to it. He did not address the recording in any meaningful way. There is very little you can do with a recording of your client's voice in a 42-minute conversation with the person he is accused of killing. Sarah's testimony. Sarah Okafor testified on the 6th day of trial. She was on the stand for 3 hours, 2 hours for the prosecution, 1 for the defense. She was composed, specific, and, when asked to describe the 11 days during which she had received messages from Jason's phone that were not from Jason, she delivered what multiple courtroom observers described as the most significant witness testimony of the trial. She described, item by item, the details that had not fit. The absent nickname. The spelling. The missing ex, she described the decision to open Jason's laptop and what she had found. She described driving to the business office and speaking to Diane Tully. She described the folder on her kitchen table. She was asked by Drago, on cross-examination, whether she had considered the possibility that her analysis was motivated by denial, that she had constructed a case against Derek Shaw because accepting that Jason had simply left was too painful. It was a legitimate cross-examination question. Sarah answered it with a composure that the courtroom took a moment to process. She said, "Mr. Drago, the possibility that Jason had chosen to leave crossed my mind on day one. I eliminated it on day two. Not because I couldn't bear it, but because the evidence didn't support it. I work in patient navigation. When a patient's condition doesn't fit their diagnosis, I don't insist on the diagnosis. I look for a better explanation. The evidence gave me a better explanation. I followed it." Drago had no follow-up question. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. On September 30th, 2022, they returned. Guilty. First-degree murder. Guilty. Financial fraud. Guilty. Evidence tampering. 3 counts. 3 verdicts. One jury that had heard 42 minutes of Jason Pellegrino's voice and had understood what it meant that there were not 43. Derek Shaw was sentenced on November 15, 2022. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder count, with consecutive sentences on the fraud and tampering counts. He is currently incarcerated at the Lexington Assessment and Reception Center in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. He has filed one appeal. It was denied. Gus Harmon, sentenced separately, received 6 years. He has served his time and been released on probation. There are several things I want to say before we close this case. The first is about Jason. Jason Pellegrino built a business from nothing because he believed in the value of work done properly and relationships maintained with honesty. He walked into a confrontation on September 28, 2021, with documentation and an attorney's guidance and a voice recorder running, because he believed in process and because, even at that point, he was trying to give his business partner an opportunity to explain rather than simply acting on what he already knew. That is the kind of person he was. The kind of person who gives people a chance they have not earned and does not survive the giving of it. The ring in the truck center console was given to Sarah at the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, after it had been cleared as no longer needed as evidence. She has said, in interviews, that she does not wear it. That it lives in the box in a specific place in her home and that she knows where it is at all times, and that is enough for now. Sarah Okafor left her hospital position in early 2022. She now works as a patient advocate consultant, independent, serving families navigating complex care situations. She has spoken publicly, at victim advocacy events and in media interviews, about the 11 days and about the specific skills that her professional background gave her access to when she needed them most. She is careful, in those interviews, not to present herself as remarkable. She consistently redirects toward Jason, toward who he was, what he built, what was taken. When asked whether she considers herself responsible for the prosecution's success, she gives a version of the same answer: "I gave Detective Webb a folder. He and his team did the rest. I just couldn't stop until I knew." Detective Webb, for his part, has said in subsequent press coverage that Sarah's documentation shortened the investigation by what he estimated was several weeks. And that in a case where physical evidence was time-sensitive and deteriorating, several weeks may have been the difference between a conviction and a cold case. Derek Shaw declined to make a statement at sentencing. He sat through the entire proceeding with the controlled, interior stillness of a man who had decided, at some point between his arrest and his conviction, Then his position was the position and that no further engagement with the people in that courtroom was going to change it. He looked at the judge when the sentence was read. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at Jason's family. His attorney told reporters on the courthouse steps that they would continue to pursue all available avenues. He said it with the specific tone of a person performing the statement rather than believing it. The business, Pellegrino Property Services, was wound up in early 2023. The staff were given as much notice as the dissolution process allowed. Several of them, according to the Tulsa World's coverage of the trial's aftermath, had attended the sentencing. They sat together in the gallery. They wore, several of them, the company's polo shirts, the ones with the Pellegrino Property Services logo on the chest. They were there because Jason had built something and they had been part of it, and they wanted to be present when the person who had ended it was told what came next for him. Sarah Okafor spent 11 days refusing to accept what she was being told. She used the skills she had, the access she had, and the knowledge of the man she loved to find the truth that someone very deliberately tried to bury. She did not do this because she is extraordinary. She did it because she was paying attention. Because the details mattered to her. Because she asked the question, "Does this fit?" and kept asking it until the answer was honest. In a different version of this story, those 11 days of messages are enough. The trail goes cold. Derek Shaw invokes the survivorship clause, takes the business, and moves on. The folder on the kitchen table is the reason that version is not the one we are telling.